The dust rose in slow spirals around the wooden wheels of the government wagon, and in that haze of late afternoon light, she dropped to her knees. Her dress was already torn at the hem, stained with the kind of dirt that comes from sleeping on floors and walking roads with nowhere to go. And now the fabric gathered around her legs like a shroud as she pressed her palms flat against the packed earth. The Indian Agency outpost behind her was a squat, weathered building that smelled of old tobacco and ink, a place where Liz was signed away on paper and people became numbers and ledgers no one would ever read twice. The agent stood on the porch with his arms crossed, his face carved into the expression of a man who had stopped seeing people years ago, and beside him a pair of soldiers leaned against the railing, their rifles casual, their eyes barred. They had seen this before, or something close enough to it, and they were already thinking about supper. But she was not thinking about supper, or tomorrow, or anything beyond the next few seconds, because the wagon was waiting and the driver was waiting and the road east was waiting. And at the end of that road was a women's institution with iron beds and rules that would grind her down to nothing. So she looked up, not at the agent or the soldiers, but at the man standing apart from them all, silent and still as stone, a Comanche widower whose name she had heard only in whispers, and she said the word that would either save her or condemn her. "Don't send me away. I can work. I can build a family." The air seemed to stop moving, and for a moment even the horses were quiet, and the widower's dark eyes met hers with something she could not name, grief or recognition, or the terrible weight of a choice he had not asked to carry. His name was Nakoni, and along the Rio Grande frontier they spoke it carefully, the way you speak the name of a man who has walked through fire and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. He was not old, perhaps 30 winters, but something in his face made him seem ancient, as though he carried the weight of 100 lifetimes behind his eyes. He lived alone now, in a small camp tucked into the hills where the juniper trees grew thick and the wind moved through the canyon like the breath of something sleeping. And he had lived that way for 3 years, ever since the morning the soldiers came to their winter lodgings and turned the world into smoke and screaming. He could still hear his children's laughter if he let himself remember it, the high bright sound of his daughter chasing her brother through the grass, and he could still hear his wife's voice calling them back for the evening meal, her hands busy with the cooking fire, her smile reserved only for him when the children were not looking. But those sounds were buried now beneath the memory of gunfire and the roar of flames eating through buffalo hide and cottonwood poles, and beneath the silence that came after, the kind of silence that is not peaceful but empty, a void where life used to be. He had sworn then, standing in the ashes with his hands still burned from pulling bodies free, that he would never again let anyone close enough to lose, because grief was a country he could survive only once. Yet now, watching this girl on her knees in the dust, begging not to be cast away like refuse, he saw in her desperation the same helplessness he had once known, the terrible understanding that your fate belongs to someone else and they do not care. And so, without knowing why or what it would cost him, Nakoni stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmur of the gathered crowd, and the agent's eyes narrowed as the widower began to speak. Her name was Anna, and she had learned early that being wanted was different from being kept. Her parents had been good people, the kind who took in children no one else would claim, who set extra places at the table and asked no questions about where you came from or what you had done. And for a while their small homestead near the Brazos had felt like the only safe place in the world. But good people died just as easily as bad ones. And when fever took her mother in the spring and a fall from a horse took her father that winter, Anna found herself passed from house to house like a borrowed tool, useful enough to keep around but never valuable enough to protect. She cooked in homes where she was not allowed to sit at the table, mended clothes for families who would not meet her eyes, scrubbed floors, and minded children and carried water until her hands cracked and bled, and at every place she told herself this time would be different. This time they would see her as more than just another mouth to feed. But different never came, and eventually the last family brought her to the agency with a story about needing the space, and the agent wrote her name in his book under the column marked unattached females and told her she would be sent east to a women's institution where they needed workers for the textile mills. She did not argue then because arguing had never changed anything. But in the week she waited for the wagon, she made herself useful in small, quiet ways, sitting up through the night with sick children when no one else would, slipping her own food to the younger ones who cried from hunger, stepping between a drunken clerk and a boy who had stolen bread, taking the blow meant for him without a sound. She had noticed the Comanche widower on one of those days, when he came to the agency to trade and a group of white men began shouting at a Comanche child who had wandered too close to their horses, and she had watched him move between them with a calm that was more frightening than any threat, his presence alone enough to make grown men step back and reconsider their courage. Now, kneeling in the dust with her future dissolving into nothing, she looked at him and saw not safety exactly, but the possibility of being seen, of being chosen instead of discarded, and she held his gaze with every ounce of hope she had left, not knowing that what she was asking for would cost them both far more than either could imagine. Nakoni spoke fewer than 20 words to the agent, but they were enough, and the agent's face went tight with the kind of anger that comes from being challenged by someone you have decided is beneath you. There was paperwork, of course, because the government loved its paperwork more than it loved people, and Anna watched her name get transferred from one column to another, from unattached female destined for institutional labor to hired helper attached to Comanche Scout, and she knew the words meant nothing except that she was still property, just under different management now. But property with a choice was better than property with none, and when Nakoni turned toward his horse without looking back, she followed, her few belongings tied in a cloth that had once been a flour sack, and neither of them spoke as they left the agency behind and rode into the wide empty plains that stretched toward the hills. His camp was a day's ride northwest, tucked into a valley where a spring fed a thin creek and the cottonwoods grew dense enough to hide smoke, and when they arrived in the failing light she saw how small his world had become. A single lodge, a fire pit ringed with stones, a few tools hanging from a wooden frame, and nothing else. No neighbors, no voices, just the wind and the distant cry of hawks. She set to work immediately because work was the only language she knew how to speak when words felt too dangerous, and she built up the fire, boiled water for coffee, sorted through his meager supplies and began to organize what little he had, mending a torn blanket, patching a hole in his spare shirt, moving quietly so as not to disturb the silence he seemed to wear like armor. He watched her with the careful attention of a man who has learned not to trust ease, and he gave her rules in a low voice. Do not wander past the creek alone. Do not touch his weapons. Do not ask questions he does not offer to answer. And she nodded to each one, understanding that safety here was earned, not given. The whispers started almost immediately, carried by relatives who came to trade or curious neighbors from a mixed camp 2 valleys over, Comanche voices blending with Spanish and broken English, all asking the same questions. Why would he take a white woman into his home? What did he think would come of it? Did he not remember what happened the last time he let himself care? And she heard the whispers too, so the way people looked at her when they visited, some with pity, some with suspicion, and some with a kind of knowing sadness, as if they could already see the ending and were just waiting for it to arrive. But she kept working, kept proving her value in the only way she knew. And on the 3rd evening, as the light turned gold and the air cooled, she found among his things a small leather pouch that had come loose at the seam, and inside it she saw a child's moccasin, tiny and carefully beaded, and without asking she sat by the fire and began to repair the pouch with thread she had carried from the agency, her hands steady and sure. Nakoni said nothing, but when she finished and placed it back where she had found it, she saw something shift in his face, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. And for the first time since they left the agency, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like the beginning of something neither of them had names for yet. The first threat came on horseback, 3 men in dust-covered coats who rode into the agency asking questions about a girl who fit Anna's description, and the agent listened with the careful attention of a man calculating profit and loss. They said they were distant cousins, that her father had owned a small parcel of land before he died, that there were documents to sign and arrangements to be made, but their eyes were cold and their smiles were thin, and anyone who had lived on the frontier long enough knew the difference between family concern and opportunistic greed. Word reached Nakoni's camp through a trader who owed him a favor, and the message was clear. Men were looking for the white woman, and they had money enough to make the agent cooperative. The second threat came from closer to home, from voices he had known his whole life, elders and warriors who arrived at his fire one evening with faces set in the hard lines of people delivering an ultimatum they do not want to give. They spoke in Comanche, their words measured but firm, reminding him that white women brought white men, that soldiers used any excuse to ride into camps and ask questions that led to burning lodges and broken treaties, that his grief did not give him the right to endanger everyone who lived within a day's ride of his solitude. One of them, an older man who had lost 2 sons in the same raid that took Nakoni's family, said it plainly. The girl must go, not because she had done wrong, but because her presence was a beacon for the kind of attention that got people killed. Nakoni listened in silence, his face revealing nothing. But inside he felt the familiar weight of impossible choices, the kind where every path leads to loss and the only question is who pays the price. That night, Anna sat outside the lodge, close enough to the fire to hear the voices even though she could not understand the words, and she knew from the tone and the long silences what they were discussing, knew that she had become the problem she had spent her whole life trying not to be. When the men left and Nakoni stood alone by the fire, she came to him with her hands folded and her voice steady despite the tears that streaked her face, and she told him she would leave in the morning if that was what kept him and his people safe, that she understood the cost of her being here, that she had no right to ask him to carry that burden. But then her voice broke just slightly, and she said what mattered most. She had meant every word she spoke of the agency, that she wanted to work, to earn her place, to help him build something that looked like family again, not because she was desperate, though she was, but because she had seen in him something she recognized, the loneliness of someone who had been useful to everyone but cherished by no one. And she thought maybe, just maybe, they could be less alone together than they were apart. They came at midday when the sun was high and the shadows were short. 4 men in a wagon with a document folded in the lead man's coat pocket. And they rode straight to the agency with the confidence of people who believe paper always won over people. Nakoni had brought Anna with him that morning because he had planned, in the hollow hours before dawn, to let her go, to accept that his solitude was the price he paid for keeping others safe, and she had ridden beside him in silence, her face calm in the way of someone who has already made peace with grief. The agent was waiting on the porch, and the men dismounted with loud voices and easy laughter, talking about the trouble they had gone to tracking down this particular piece of lost property. And one of them, a thick-shouldered man with a beard stained yellow from tobacco, waved the paper like a flag of victory and announced that the girl was coming with them, either back to family obligations in Missouri or to a match he had arranged himself, depending on which story served him better in the moment. The agent nodded, already turning toward Anna with the bored efficiency of a man finishing paperwork, and he told her to get in the wagon, that this matter was settled, that she had caused enough disruption and it was time she learned her place. But Anna did not move toward the wagon, did not drop her eyes or fold her hands in the submissive posture she had learned as a child, and instead she stood with her shoulders back and her voice clear, telling them that she had worked every day since leaving this place, that she had cooked and mended and kept her home, that for the first time in her life she had felt what it meant to be seen as someone who mattered rather than someone who was merely useful, and that she would not go back to being cargo in someone else's plan. The men laughed, not cruelly but dismissively, the way people laugh at children who announce grand intentions, and the thick-shouldered man moved toward her, his hand reaching for her arm, his grip already tightening when Nakoni stepped forward and placed himself between them, his body a wall, his voice low and steady as he spoke in English so everyone would understand. He said that she was under his protection, that the agent himself had signed the paper that placed her in his household, that by Comanche law and by the agreement they had witnessed she was his responsibility, and that no one would take her without his consent, which he would not give. The air seemed to thicken, and hands moved slowly toward gun belts, fingers hovering near leather, and the crowd that had gathered to watch went silent, understanding that they were standing at the edge of something that could spill blood into the dust. Then a voice cut through the tension, an older cavalry colonel who had been sitting in the shade of the agency porch, a man who had seen enough frontier violence to recognize the moment before it started, and he stood and walked forward with the careful steps of someone defusing a bomb. He looked at the paper, looked at Anna, looked at Nakoni, and then he looked at the thick-shouldered man and told him plainly that the girl was safer and less trouble where she was, that dragging her away by force would bring more problems than it solved, and that sometimes the law was better served by leaving well enough alone. The men argued, but without conviction, because they had come for easy money, not a fight with a Comanche warrior and a colonel who had stopped caring about their grievances, and eventually they climbed back into their wagon, the document meaningless, their threats hollow. The agent made a notation in his book, a grudging acknowledgement that Anna would remain in Nakoni's household, not as a wife yet, not with ceremony or formal recognition, but as someone allowed to stay, allowed to work, allowed to exist in the narrow space they had carved out together at the edge of two worlds that wanted nothing to do with either of them. 6 months passed like water over stone, slow and steady, wearing away the sharp edges of fear and replacing them with something softer. The homestead had changed in small ways that spoke of permanence. Rows of young corn and squash pushing up through the earth, the lodge patched and reinforced for winter, a wooden bench near the fire where they sat together in the evenings, and inside, tucked in the corner, a small cradle that Nakoni had begun carving from cottonwood, his hands working the wood with a care that spoke of hope he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Anna no longer looked over her shoulder when riders appeared on the horizon, and Nakoni no longer carried his grief like a shield between himself and the world, and when children from the nearby camp came to visit, drawn by the smell of her cooking and the quiet safety of his presence, they stayed longer each time, their laughter filling spaces that had been silent too long. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Anna turned to Nakoni and said softly that she had been right, that she could work, that they were building a family. But this time the words were not a plea or a promise. There was simply the truth of what already existed between them. And he nodded, his hand finding hers, both of them understanding that family was not always the one you were born into, but sometimes the one that chose you when the rest of the world had turned away. If this story moved you, I think you'll love these two. One about a widow who saved an outcast boy and found her own redemption, and another about a healer who chose loyalty over safety. Subscribe if you believe in stories about courage, respect, and the families we build when the world says we don't belong. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone.